Hi, okay, welcome back to the second part of this discussion. Now I'm going to talk specifically about Leave No Trace, and I am reading from some notes, so please forgive me for pausing periodically. So, my first question is, how does the pacing or experience of time through the camera shots and the edits reflect conceptual oppositions, the ones that we talked about earlier in the semester? Art versus popular cinema, realism versus melodrama, moralism versus immoralism. So when we talk about art versus popular cinema, what we're talking about is the difference between, like, let's say, spectacle movies and contemplative movies. Maybe Koyaanisqatsi, of course, is more on the art side. Day After Tomorrow is more on the spectrum side. So I think that this film is more on the art side. If you think about the way it's paced, it's very slow, it's very contemplative. It gives you a lot of space to think and to imagine and to sort of explore your ideas. And then in terms of realism versus melodrama, it's very realistic. It uses the techniques that you would see in documentary film with handheld cameras or reality TV. The characters, the settings, the environments are not fantasies. They are very realistic situations that people find themselves in. And then this idea of moralism versus immoralism. Well, moralistic films are ones that really hit you over the head, like this is the right, proper way to do something, and this is the bad way, this is the wrong way. Spielberg films are very moralistic. And I think this film is ambiguous. Some of the characters are kind of moral and kind of immoral. There's kind of a mix, which also would make this more of an art movie, because art movies tend to have more of these sort of ambiguous characters. So for this, I would argue it's actually a better film. I like films that are open-ended. I don't like this idea of being forced to decide or to think for me that someone is good or bad. I want to make that decision myself, and I think this film is good at doing that. Okay, so what environmental ideologies are expressed in the film? And what symbols are used to express these different ideologies? Does the filmmaker actually have a preference? So let me go back to this chart that we talked about earlier in the semester. Here you have on the left the unrestrained instrumentalism of anthropocentrism. This could be represented by is represented by the Christmas tree farm. This is a very controlled use of nature, whereas on the opposite side, dark green or ecocentric point of view is let nature be its own thing, let it go on its own, let it be wild. And you see that with the example of the parks in the forest, in the wilderness. And then in between, there's sort of, on the spectrum, you can have positions that are neither extreme. For example, the community at the end of the film, the old retirement community that lives in trailers, are kind of on the conservationist side, where they're conserving nature. They have a low impact, but they also have the presence of their own civilization, their own needs. So it's sort of a median point between the anthropocentric and ecocentric point of view. I think that probably represents the point of view of the filmmaker as sort of the most ideal. Okay, so how is the power structure represented? Well, very clearly through the police, through the state. That's very symbolic when the police come to get them out of the park. Which relates to this next question is, who gets to decide what is unhoused, what is homeless? And I think that there's this tension between the people who want to define that for themselves versus that definition coming from the state. The state decides where you can or cannot live. And deciding, even though our main characters believe that they have a home living in the wilderness, the state says, no, technically you don't have a home. A home is a house or an apartment or something like that. Which is important to the root of the word ecology, oikos, O-I-K-O-S is Greek, means households. So ecology in its earliest form meant household, it meant home, eco. Also, that's the root of economics. So what's interesting is that the root for economics and ecology has the same concept of home, that nature is a home, but you have to manage your resources. You have to manage your home. Okay, what is the conflict experienced by the father? How does that fit into the larger American monomyth of the West and individuality? So the father is conflicted about many different things. There's the conflict between him and the state. There's a conflict between him and his daughter. There's a conflict within himself, between, whatever trauma that he experienced and him trying to find some kind of harmony. So let's go back to these myths of the West that we talked about earlier. Let me move this here so you can see. And let's look at this ideal, the idea of self-reliance, unspeakable will, doer of deeds, wielder of power, exceptionalism, resourceful, humility, sense of duty, has power but doesn't abuse it, confident, manifest destiny. I think that the father figure actually has all of these characteristics. The only one that I would say that maybe he doesn't abuse his power, I think to some extent he is abusive psychologically to his daughter. So that means that in a sense he also exhibits these very dark side characteristics. He's outside the law. He is fascistic towards his daughter. He's destructive towards her life. He doesn't care about the law. And he does have a very, this sort of, I think, black and white view of the world of what is good and what is evil. And of course, he's a white male. And he has this fragile masculinity. And we talked about this earlier in the semester. His masculinity is constantly on the verge of being threatened. And he's, I think one of his biggest fears is to be humiliated by the state, to be humiliated by the community, to be humiliated by his boss at this new house that he has to move into. So I was on the fence about whether or not I should show this film because I wanted to give you a clearly defined genre film. Like Revenant is much more of a genre film when it comes to like Westerns. And in the end, for different reasons, this film violates all the genres, but on the other hand, it is a genre film. As these examples show us, the myth of the West is very much embedded in the father figure, but it's a critique, I think, of the genre in some senses. So it's not using the genre in a conventional way, but using the genre as a way of critiquing. Okay, so I'll talk more about this in a minute. Is the father a moral character? Do you think that he is an example of hyper-individualism? That's not clear. In class, we talked about whether he was a moral character or not. A little bit. Not towards his daughter. I mean, he clearly wants to protect her. He cares for her. He wants to protect. And he educates her. He teaches her how to survive. He's concerned about that. But he's also very hyper-individualistic, and all he cares about is, in the end, is his own individualism. So, yeah. Here's a quote from the film. The daughter. It's easier if we adapt. Father. How important are their judgments? Daughter. I guess I'll find out. And then she's a great actress. She suppresses that cry. And I think that at that point she's feeling overly controlled by her father, and she can't even express her own feelings. That's how controlled she is. So in that sense, he's very fascistic towards her. Does she want a normal life? I think to some extent, yes. I mean, she wants maybe not a normal life, but I think she wants to be part of a community, wants to be with other people, to enjoy the company of others. So, yes. Okay. I thought I'd just make this short observation that, remember that in Blade Runner there was this test of the android, the replicant, to see his psychological state, and the computer was asking all these rapid fire questions. I thought it was kind of interesting that in this film, when the father has to go get interviewed by the state about his psychological profile, he has to use a computer and answer questions. So there was some interesting parallels there. Why is he always moving? What is he moving to? I think at the very end that gets resolved. I'm going to discuss that in a few minutes. I think perhaps the most important point in the film is where the daughter says to him at the very end, "The something that's wrong with you isn't wrong with me." That's that's the point where she really makes her own. She takes her own destiny into her control. That she realizes that she does not have to follow him. She does not have to take on the same trauma that he's experiencing. That she can leave her own life. And I think that's an important metaphor for ecology and for people and for power of sort of also a feminist point of view. Okay, let's talk about some observations that I have. So the first thing I would like to point out is the film starts off with just sounds. Sound is the perfect metaphor of the environment. It completely surrounds us. It's Marshall McLuhan talks about the environment as being acoustic. That sound is three-dimensional, so it moves all around us. So before we see a single image in this movie, we hear sound, and then the images come on. So that's the filmmaker's technique of immersing us into this environment to envelop us. And I think it was a very interesting approach. I like that a lot. Okay, so going back to this question of to what extent does this film conform to the wilderness or even Western genre, and how does it break it? Well, the way that it fundamentally breaks it is the use of camera angles. So, as I mentioned earlier in the previous video and also in the readings, the classic wilderness, the rhetoric of wilderness are these sweeping shots, these wide-angle, deep focus, and you don't get any of that in this movie. This is all the shots are very close, but they're not wide-angle, they're very tight shots. And what is the effect of that? And what also handheld is to create a sense of paranoia that you feel sort of trapped in this environment, even though they're surrounded by all these trees and then this beautiful wide open space. The relationship is between the father and the daughter is actually that's very close, that their reality is very close, that they're fighting off the outside world. And that's done very effectively through the camera shots. There's always this sense of paranoia that the father is feeling, and that's done effectively through the placement of the camera. Okay, so let's talk about, I think, one of the important dichotomies that's being explored in this movie, which is this idea of wild or wilderness versus domestic. And how is that expressed? Well, it's expressed in different ways. We talked about the Christmas trees, the wild forest versus the Christmas trees. That's one dichotomy. But also food. So the way that food is used. So in the woods, they're hand foraging their food, their mushrooms. They're cooking it in a pan with some salt. But it's all it's like hunter-gatherer type of reality. Very sort of ecocentric mode of life. And then you cut to like the house that they go live in on the tree farm. All the food is packaged. It's in plastic. And then that would be the two extremes. And then you get to the final last third act of the film where they're in the trailer park and there's this sort of retirement hippie community where people cook together, they sing and they play music and they share food. It's a very communal lifestyle. I think that's sort of the ideal sort of in between wild and domestic that the filmmaker privileges as something that is desirable. That would be sort of the desirable type of ideal community that anyone would aspire to, this sort of small scale, light footprint, shared communal space, etc. There's also this the way that dogs, you have at the beginning, the dogs are police dogs, that they're trained to find people, that they're controlled, they're very domesticated, And then at the end of the film, you have sort of the friend dog, the helper dog that helps people heal themselves. And then you have the bees, you have the horse. So these are all, the use of animals is to show animals as companion species. And I liked how that was used. That was very interesting. Okay, so we talked about the question of fragility, the fragility of white male power. He wants to be in control. He's scared of getting his dignity and pride, getting to be undermined by the state, by other men. There's always this threat of humiliation. So I think this is sort of the feminist perspective that's being brought into the film. The daughter, is represented by the seahorse. I think that's a very obvious symbol in the film. She finds a little amulet, seahorse. She studies it. She reads about it. So, what is the meaning of that? Well, the seahorse is male and female, so it's sort of a balance between male and female power. It's something special. It's also small. It's fragile. It's very elegant. It's beautiful. These are, in many ways, all the opposite of sort of this male myth that we see throughout the film. Okay. Then you have the power structure. So the power structure, I think, is an important contrast to what you see, the kind of lifestyle that the father and daughter want to live. The power structure determines rules about where you can live, whether you're homeless or not homeless, using computers, standardized tests, all these things, school, all these rules. I mean, there's clearly this contrast between the sort of social structure and sort of the freedom that is desired by the father and the daughter. I think maybe a question in the film is, can we find a balance between these two extremes? I mentioned that there is an ecopsychology reading we can bring into the film, this idea that these systems are oppressive, that they create anxiety. I mean, clearly the father is very anxious of having to interface with the state, also the daughter. The sense of homelessness that is caused by being separated from nature. And this trope of kidnapping, which comes up throughout the film, like the police controlling the bus to see if the girls are kidnapped, the truck driver asking asking the girl if she's safe, if she's being kidnapped essentially by the father. By the way, if you read the book has a slightly different storyline. One of the questions in the book is whether he's actually her real father. In fact, the book makes the point that probably he kidnapped her when she was small and made her believe that he was her father and that her mother had died. Some of you picked up on this, actually. I don't know if when you were watching it, if you thought maybe there was a sense that he actually had kidnapped her. But anyways, ecopsychology also talks about this idea of being kidnapped. That civilization kidnaps us from our true connection to nature. So I think that's an interesting discussion that we see in the film. Okay, we're getting close to finishing up here. So I would just say the last points I want to make is there seems to be a survival narrative, survival of the family, survival of the individual, survival of the land, survival of dignity, survival of well-being, and what does it take to survive, but also to heal, like the wounds that this society creates. The father is a war veteran. It's clear that he's traumatized from the war. What is it that's going to heal him? What's going to heal the daughter from the trauma that her father is passing on to her, what we call generational trauma. And then I kind of had this sort of insight that, in a way, it's also this movie's a metaphor for Buddhism, and in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, there's this idea of the Bardo state, that when you die, your spirit roams the sort of in-between world between the living and the dead, sort of until it finds its final path to transcend all the things that tie you to earth, that keep you hold you back to reincarnation, and frees you, such as enlightenment. And I think that the father, in many senses, is dead. That he is an undead man walking, a zombie in some ways, walking through the land of the undead, trying to find his path to release his karma, to go to transcend the world so he can be free. And I think that happens at the very end of the movie when the daughter releases him. She's sort of, in a way, his guide. She brings him to the edge of the wild, where he can then go and live by himself into his own healing path, his own whatever, to resolve his own karma. But which also frees her to follow her own path. So he's released from the bardo in a sense. He walks through this land of the undead, and then he goes off into enlightenment. Well, that remains to be seen. We don't see how ultimately things turn out for him. Ultimately, I think that there's this idea of the importance of finding a home. I think that's the ultimate message of this film. You know, what does home mean? And that there are different ways to define home, and different paths towards defining your home. Okay, so that's it. I'll post these notes if you want to read through them on the class website. This is part 2 of our discussion of wilderness, and there'll be more to come. This has been fun. Thanks. I'll see you later.